So I spent about a week building my own custom AI agent. By the end, I had an agent that could read and send iMessages for me, search my Slack, my Gmail, even pull data like reviews or build statuses from App Store Connect directly. I've been using it every day and I was really hoping to release it and let other people use it, but I realized there are some major limitations that make that kind of difficult. We'll get into that later in the video. In this video, I want to walk through everything I learned about the Agent SDK as I've been playing with it. We'll go through what it is, how it's so different, how I structured things when I was building with it, and hopefully by the end of it, you can start building on top of it too. And at a minimum, at least have a better understanding of the technology and how you can apply it as well. There's been a ton of hype around AI agents recently, which kind of surprised me because AI agents have been around for a while. We even built one on this channel a few months ago for my daily planning app, Ellie. So I was curious, what actually changed? Turns out, if you cut through all the noise, what happened was Anthropic released their Agent SDK, which is basically a way for developers to build their own agents on top of the same technologies that powers Claude Code. If you're new here, welcome to the video. My name is Chris and I build productivity apps and I teach everything I'm learning here on this channel. Before we get into it, let me show you what I built in a week so you can get a sense of what's possible right now. So this is my custom agent, which I'm calling Luna L1. I even created this custom Luna Gachi, which is a mascot for the app, obviously based on my dog. On the surface, it looks like ChatGPT, but at least to me, it's way more powerful. I've got it connected to a bunch of tools that ChatGPT can have access to, like Slack, Gmail, Notion, but I also have it hooked up to other things that ChatGPT can't get to, like my iMessages, for example. I can ask it something like, is there anything urgent I need to respond to? And unlike ChatGPT and other agents, which will probably just check the last 10 emails I had, maybe 1 or 2 Slack messages, this thing is way more thorough. It's really gonna go through the tools and think logically about what is urgent to me, and then surface what it believes are urgent messages that I should respond to. Because of that, it takes a lot longer, sometimes 1 to 2 minutes to actually give me a response, but I prefer that because the responses are usually way more accurate. I can even ask business questions like, what is my current churn rate? What version of Ellie is live on the App Store right now? Because it's hooked up to things like ChartMogul and App Store Connect, which I use to aggregate data for my apps. It has its own memory system and it can run scheduled workflows. So every morning I'm having it summarize any action items I need to go through from the night before. And I made it available on web and iOS, so when something urgent comes in, it can actually just send me a push notification, which is really great. So this is what I built with the Agent SDK in about a week. It's much more personalized and in my opinion, better than ChatGPT, but there are some serious limitations which we'll get to in the video. But for now, let's walk through how the Agent SDK works and how agents work in general. If you've heard the word agent before and you're not totally sure what that means, it's actually a lot simpler than it sounds. An agent is really just 3 things: an LLM like Claude Sonnet or GPT, a set of tools which the LLM can then control, and a loop where the agent basically goes through this loop, executes tools, and keeps going until it feels like it completed the task. At the core, that is basically what an agent is. And here's a flow so you can visualize what this all looks like together. You basically give an AI a task, it thinks about what tool to use, executes that tool, and then it looks at the results and says, am I done here? Is there anything else I need? Should I go through the loop again? And it keeps repeating and looping, using more and more tools until it feels like it's completed the task. This is what an agent looks like. It's literally just a while loop. You call an LLM, it decides what tool it's going to use, it's going to execute that tool, and then add the results back in, and then loop again. Even though this is a really simple example, there's still a lot of boilerplate code here, and you're the one that has to manage the conversation history, executing the tool calls, and dealing with all of the different edge cases that happens when you have a loop like this. But the good news is that people came up with a bunch of libraries to try to simplify this. And the most popular one, which has been around for a few months, is Vercel's AI SDK. So instead of all of this code to do the while loop, you can actually just replace it with something much simpler. It's the same exact functionality, but the AI SDK handles the loop, the tool call, the message conversation history, streaming. All of that stuff is handled for you under the hood. All you have to do is define the tools. You set the maximum number of steps. So basically, when should the agent stop if it's not getting it? And then you let it run. This is how I've been building agents in all of my apps so far now. Okay, so the AI SDK from Vercel already exists, then what is all the hype about the Agent SDK from Anthropic? What is different? At the end of the day, they're both gonna let you create an agent, but the way they go about it is completely different. To put it simply, the stuff you're given with the Agent SDK is just much more powerful because you get the same exact architecture and some of the same tools that you get with Claude Code. And Claude Code is currently one of the, if not the best agent on the market right now, which on paper, they look kind of similar to be honest, but then in practice, you really can feel the difference. tools. This is honestly a bit of an oversimplification just for the sake of the video, so let's get into some specifics of why the Agent SDK is so interesting and how they implement things. One key difference is how it handles conversations in general. Typically with most frameworks like the AI SDK, you're gonna have to manually pass around a messages array and you're the one that's gonna have to maintain that conversation history. With the Agent SDK, it's much simpler. They'll give you a session ID and they'll manage all of the context of the conversation for you. On that note, it also supports compaction automatically. And this is where when the conversation gets super long, it's actually gonna automatically summarize all of the earlier parts to save on tokens. This is the same thing that Claude Code uses, and it's a big deal if you're doing anything that has a long-running conversation. And the best part is you don't have to configure any of it. It just happens automatically when the context gets large. This was a really annoying thing you had to figure out and implement yourself if you were using something like the AI SDK. Now, the third thing is you get access to the same exact tools that Claude Code has access to. You get Bash for running commands, read and edit for files, grep and glob for searching, and even their web search and web scraping tool. And these are some of the best default tools I have found, especially their web search tool. One hypothesis that I have is that since Claude Code only has a few tools, Anthropic was able to really focus on making sure that they are very, very good. And you can take advantage of them because it just comes out of the box with this SDK. You also have access to a bunch of powerful things like you can define sub-agents and a whole bunch of stuff that we don't even have time to cover. I highly recommend looking at the Agent SDK documentation if you want to see the full capabilities of this SDK. So it's not just one big innovation, it's honestly the combination of all of these small innovations that really make it feel like you're getting the same power as Claude Code, but you can apply it to your specific use case. And then the big thing that really pushed it over the edge is Anthropic started allowing people to use their Anthropic subscription, so like your Claude Code subscription, with the Agent SDK. So if you build something on top of the Agent SDK, instead of having to pay every time you consume tokens, they will just take it out of your Claude Code subscription. And at the time of recording, the subscription is severely underpriced. Someone ran the calculations and said that if you pay for the $200 a month Claude Code plan, you get about $2,000 of API tokens out of it each month. So this is a huge deal for people who wanted to experiment and build their own custom agents for themselves. You can use the subscription and save a ton of money. One important caveat though, if you do plan on releasing this agent so other people can use it, they are not allowed to use your Claude Code subscription. You will have to switch to API billing to do that. On that note, some other things to know when going in. Even though they will handle the sessions and the conversation context, you still are responsible for storing the conversation somewhere if you want to render it on a page, for example. I think they recently added the ability to pull the conversation from a specific session, but I think there are some limitations with that. Like the sessions only live for about 30 days or something, so it's much better to store it and manage that yourself. You have to persist them in a database. I'm using Convex, which we'll talk about in a second, and you do have to build your own memory system as well. The SDK does have a memory command, but it is in beta at the time of recording, and for my limited usage of it, it is pretty basic. So I ended up building my own memory system, which we'll cover in the video. That's actually where a lot of the interesting architecture kind of came in, and the database I chose to store and maintain that system is also in Convex. And a huge shout out to Convex for actually sponsoring this video. If you've been following along, you know that I've been using so many different database providers for all of my different projects, and I kept hearing about Convex from so many people in my comments that I was like, okay, I have to go check it out. I finally decided to try it for the project, and I'm glad I listened to you guys because I've been extremely impressed. Some of the big benefits I wanted to highlight are that it's completely real-time out of the box, which is amazing because I'm running this thing on both my phone and on the web. So when I'm having conversation, it's going to sync in real time. It was also incredibly easy to work with Claude Code on the project because all the infrastructure is code. I didn't have to use any MCP to connect to the database and look at the database schema. It was already there baked into the project because of the way Convex is set up. So Claude Code, which is what I was using for the project, really understood what was going on. I was not aware of some of these things when I signed up, but they also had some really cool built-in things like cron jobs and functions with really good logs. These are usually things that are really annoying for me to set up because I have to spin up a separate backend and then debug it, but having it all in one place was actually really convenient. I'm using their cron jobs to power some of the automation, so when I'm having it check every morning to send me critical Slack messages, for example, it's using cron jobs to power all of that. So a huge shout out to them. I'm really glad I got to try it for this project, and I'm 100% going to be using it for future projects as well. They have a generous free tier, and I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check them out. Before we go deeper into the memory architecture, let's first talk about tools. Tools are super powerful, arguably the most powerful thing about the agents because it lets agents actually do things. Now, the way that tools work in the Agent SDK is through something called MCP, which is Model Context Protocol. If you're not familiar with MCPs, it's basically a way for an agent to communicate and interact with an external service. So here's what it looks like. So you define the tool name, a description of the tool, which is really, really important to define well because this is how the agent's going to choose what tool to use, a ZOD schema, which is basically just the schema or the format for the inputs, and a handler function that actually runs when the agent calls it. So this is the bulk of the actual tool operation. Then you bundle it into an MCP server and you pass it into the query. And I believe that the naming convention does have to follow this format. On top of your custom tools, the SDK also gives you all of these powerful built-in tools like bash for running commands, read and edit for files, grep and glob for searching, and even their really powerful optimized web search. And you just add them into this allowed tools array by name. And the SDK is going to handle the execution loop, the conversation state, automatically parsing the results of the tools. You just need to define the tool itself and then it handles everything for you. Aside from tools, the other thing you can give the agent SDK are skills. Skills are basically a way for you to give very specific capabilities to your agent without bloating the context, and they can be loaded on demand. In the agent SDK, skills are not a code object or anything. They're actually organized as folders in your file system, and they have to follow this specific format. So this is what the actual file structure for my project actually has to look like. Each skill has its own folder, and there's a skill MD file that has two parts, a YAML formatter for the metadata, and then a markdown content with detailed instructions. And just a note, you don't pass the skills into the query like you do with available tools. Instead, skills are auto-discovered. So when your agent starts up, the SDK is going to scan this folder list, and it's just going to read the name and descriptions from each of the skill MD files. That very lightweight metadata. And it adds these descriptions to the system prompt. So then when a user says something like, check my Slack for urgent messages, the agent's going to look at these descriptions, recognize the Slack integration as a relevant skill, and then it's going to load that instruction into the context. There is a brilliant talk that I saw from some people from Anthropic talking about skills and why they architected it the way that they did. I'll leave a link if you want to go check that out, but highly recommend watching that. Really cool to see the decisions behind that. But you're not actually telling it what skills to use. It's going to automatically figure this out based on the description, which means it's important to write really good descriptions because if you're too vague, then Claude might not know whether it's appropriate to call the tool or not. So really, really think through the descriptions when you're writing them. And this whole skill system that they have where it's loaded on demand is called progressive disclosure. So it'll only load the relevant skills when it needs it. So you can have dozens of skills installed and it's not going to affect the context window that heavily. A quick heads up because this tripped me up a little bit, so I want to save you some debugging time. This is how you're actually supposed to enable skills. The skill tool has to be explicitly passed into the allowed tools array. And setting sources and the CWD parameter needs to be configured so it knows where to look for those skills files. You can actually have project skills that are loaded just in the project, or you can have user skills which will load across all different projects depending on the settings that you choose here. Let's go a little bit deeper on the memory side because that's where a lot of fun architectural decisions had to be made, and I really wanted to share it with you guys. Now, there are 1,000 ways to architect memory for an agent, but here's a basic system I landed on after some trial and error. I'm storing all of my memories in Convex, bucketed into different categories based on important and persistence. I have three main types of memory. There's session memory. So this is the current conversation context, and this is what gets loaded every time you load up a new chat or conversation. And then persistent memory. So this is important facts about me, my preferences, my projects, things like Chris builds productivity apps, he has a dog named Luna. And then we have archival memory. So these are reference material, really heavy, large amounts of data, like full YouTube scripts I've downloaded to reference later, notes on creators I study in the past project documentation, stuff that does not make sense to load into every conversation, but I do plan on referencing at some point. But the key thing that makes my memory system powerful is making sure that my agent is proactively using the memory system and keeping it up to date by itself. So I have this skills file, which I saved here. It's like a memory skill, and it defines when my agent should save memories. And I built these custom tools that my agent can use to interact with this memory layer. And all of the memories are saved inside of Convex. And the system prompt, I have a couple of explicit instructions, like use the memory tools proactively to save critical information without being asked, save a memory whenever I give you a correction. This is a huge one. And this combination makes it so that my agent doesn't need me to explicitly say, remember this. It's just automatically going to recognize important information and save it. Usually what people do is they just parse the conversation history and then try to do some post-processing to try to save critical information. But this is great because I can have the agent do all of it for me. So that's the memory layer that I created. It gives my agent the ability to remember very important pieces of information and critical feedback that I give it. It's something that makes it feel so personalized compared to something like ChatGPT. But now that you have a hopefully better understanding of the Agent SDK, let's talk about why I decided not to release the custom agent that I built. The brutal reality, which I think everyone building with this stuff needs to understand, is that it is very, very expensive, at least at the time of recording. The Agent SDK actually has a way for you to see the cost of each message. So I enabled this and I was tracking all of my cost as I was using my own agent over the last couple days. And I noticed it, if you're using it, at least the way I'm using it, it gets really expensive, especially if you're using something like Opus 4.6 for a lot of the messages. A pretty big message, like asking it to find critical messages that I need to respond to, where it has to use a lot of tool calls, do a lot of searching, that costs around $2 to $3 in some cases. I've noticed that normal messages usually cost between 7 and 30 cents, so not as bad as $2, $3, but still, that is pretty expensive. With my current usage, I estimate that my costs are somewhere between $200 to $400 a month. Luckily, I'm not actually paying that because I get to use my $200 a month Claude Code subscription, but the problem is if I plan to release this to you guys, then I can't use my Claude Code subscription. I have to pay API pricing. And if I assume that people will use it half the amount I'm using and my costs are about $100 per user, that means I have to probably charge something like $200 a month for a subscription to do this safely. And with ChatGPT and Claude costing like $20 a month and they even have free plans, I just could not imagine a world where people would be willing to pay $200 a month for my tool. And in general, I feel like this really doesn't make sense to use from a consumer standpoint, at least not right now while the models cost as much as they do. But I do think this can make sense in the business world though. So for a B2B application where businesses are able to justify a higher cost, this actually could make sense. But it's not just the cost, there are some other major limitations I ran into. Like number one was a lot of the cool things I was doing was because I had local access to my machine. So that iMessage integration that I built, it's because it's actually accessing the SQL database on my Mac to read and send messages. Unfortunately, this does not work outside of my Mac. So when I deployed it on a server, which we'll talk about, it has no access to iMessage, so I lose that ability. And to be honest, iMessage and some of these other custom tools that I built, that's what makes some of this special. So I feel like by moving it to a server and losing that, you kind of do lose some of the magic there. Another issue I ran into was authentication complexity. So some of the tools that I set up, I had to put in API keys and some other really sensitive keys to get them to work. Unfortunately, if I deploy this to other people, I can't really use some of these same methods. It's just not safe. Something that is concerning to me is I do see some OpenClaw wrappers, for example, basically asking users to feed in API keys and other really sensitive environment variables just to power the integrations. And even though it does technically work, I just don't feel comfortable with storing or having anyone do anything like that. But going back to where I do think that this can be applied, I think that the B2B world, this is the perfect place to deploy custom agents. So I'll give you an example. At my software agency, Aloha, we do a lot of work with medical clients. And one of the things we do is we have to audit for what's called HIPAA compliance. If you're not familiar, HIPAA compliance is a very manual process. And what we actually did was we used the Agent SDK to build a custom HIPAA compliance agent that can go through code bases and AWS configurations and do a first pass and identify any issues for us. A single report can cost us between $50 and $100 to generate, which might seem like a lot, but if you factor in that we're probably saving $5,000 to $10,000 worth of engineering time through that first pass, $100 is totally worth it. And I think that's where I see this being applied. It's custom, very specific agents and workflows for business use cases where a business can clearly see, oh yeah, if we can do this, we're gonna save a ton of money, 100% pay for the API tokens there. On the consumer side, I do actually think that the cost will eventually go down. You can actually use other non-Anthropic models with the Agent SDK. It's kind of hacky to do that though. And you can even set up local LLMs to work with the Agent SDK, but it was a little bit tough. Even on my very powerful machine, it wasn't running that well, but I do think it will get better. So I'm hoping that this stuff does get more accessible for consumer use cases in the future. The last thing I wanted to touch on was deployment, because if you're building an agent and it's running on your computer, you probably want to deploy this thing so you can run it when your computer is off. Now, there are a few ways to deploy this, but the way that I decided to do it was by spinning up a VPS, which is a virtual private server, where I can let this agent run freely. You can think about it like a little sandbox where the agent can write files, access different programs and tools, and it's on 24/7. The way that I have it set up is I spun up this VPS, and I'm personally using Hetzner, which is really cheap. I logged into my Anthropic subscription on this machine, so Claude Code is running there, and I deployed all of my code there. So it has access to almost everything except for the iMessage and some other applications that are Mac only. And I actually have it on the front end where I can toggle and choose, do I want to connect to my Hetzner VPS or do I want to connect to my local machine? So when possible, I actually prefer prefer to connect to my local machine so I can have access to iMessage and those Mac specific tools. But when it's off, that's when I point to the head center VPS so I can keep using it even when it's off. And that's a huge reason why I also have another database like Convex to manage the conversation history and the memory, so both of my instances can access the same exact thing. I can make a whole separate video on deployment. To be honest, it's kind of a new thing that people are still trying to figure out. And that was also another reason I wasn't comfortable releasing it. I just did not know what the proper way to deploy this stuff securely was. But I'll be doing a lot more research on this and experimenting, and hopefully I'll make another video about this in the future. I'm really only scratching the surface of the Agent SDK in this video. There's also things like sub-agents, streaming, computer use, which is this crazy thing where it can control your computer directly. There are so many features I didn't get to, and I bet by the time you're watching, there's probably even more features that they've released too. So if you want me to go deeper on this, I am very down to make a part 2. Please comment below and I can just do a more advanced version of this. But if you like this kind of content, check out my Instagram and TikTok. I post almost every other day about building productivity apps. And obviously, if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.